It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. If you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like the show, check out Patreon. Everything here Monday to Friday on AM/FM radio. You can find it on our Patreon with all the ads and the commercials cut out. And if we ever lose a station, we drop a station, something like that, you'll be able to continue hearing all this stuff that people seem to like. Our archives you could find for free at Spreaker.com. I do a live show every Friday night there. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we send you new content. When we put up new content, I play repeats every night of the week. And if you go there and you search for H.P. Albarelli Jr., A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson, and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments, you'll find an interview I did with the late, great H.P. Albarelli. When I had Hank Albarelli on the show back then, we had a great time. I really, really admired this man. I respected him a lot, and I wanted him to come back. He kept telling me, Ed, after my book's done, my Coup in Dallas book is done, the Decisive investigation into who killed JFK, I'll come on the book, I'll come on the show, come back then. And I would contact him every few months, and it wasn't until and then after he died, he passed away, that I was sent a copy of this book by his friends and co-authors and people that support his work. And so today we have in his stead Lesley Sharp, who's a contributor and co-author of the book, to talk to us about Coup in Dallas, the decisive investigation into who killed JFK. But I really encourage people to go back to Spreaker and search for A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson, and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. Lesley Sharp, are you there?
I am indeed.
Lesley, thank you so much for coming on the show. But before we get into H.P. Albarelli and Coup in Dallas, tell us about yourself. Who is Lesley Sharp?
Well, Lesley is a middle-aged, aging woman living now in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'll just, in context of our book, I'll explain how Hank phoned me and asked me to get on board with the Coup in Dallas project. I had been researching since 1993, having been in Dublin, Ireland. I was contacted by a friend who I'd worked with for the Hunt family in Dallas in the 80s, and he said, you have got to read Dick Russell's new book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And I read it and was alarmed and started reflecting on my history with the Hunt family and even events prior to that, and realized that, I was a fly on the wall and probably knew more than I knew I knew. And so I started researching the Kennedy assassination and sort of committed the rest of my life, or the last third of my life, to doing this work. And by 2013, I decided to, quote unquote, my debut would be on JFKFacts.org, Jeff Morley's blog. And I started just posting general information about Dallas, my research, my own background of working for the Hunt family in particular, and my insight. And Hank was in and out of JFKFacts.org, and he apparently started following some of my comments and exchanges at the time, particularly with Professor Adams. People may know him as being what we call the lone nut community, believing that Oswald was the only person who fired shots at Kennedy and that the Warren Commission report was as accurate as it could be. And Gene Davison, who had written a book about Oswald for the 20th anniversary that I found just obnoxious and appalling. Anyway, so I would have conflicts with Adams and Davison and others, and just saw that the community itself was not exactly a community that was warm and fuzzy. It was very contentious. And so I kind of stood up and said my piece, and I think Hank must have followed that as well, because by 2017, he found me on Facebook, contacted me by phone, and we talked pretty much every day, or texted or emailed, for the following 2 years until his untimely, unfortunate, sad death. in June of 2019. So that's my background in context of this book. And prior to that, I was in the hotel industry, sales and marketing, travel industry. I worked in Dallas for the travel agency that handled the American Society of Petroleum Engineers and the Geologist Society. Our destinations were Acapulco and the Canary Islands. Lo and behold, those destinations surfaced in our investigation. So I just feel like that, my path was set long before Dick Russell's book, long before the Hunt family. I have a sense that this was my calling, and I'm committed to seeing it through to the end. And as Hank and I agreed, this case can be solved. It's a cold case murder investigation. It's not a historical event alone. It is an investigation, a murder investigation that needs to be solved.
What about as a kid growing up? Did you have any aspirations to be an investigator or a researcher?
I, like everyone in my class, wanted to be an attorney.
Okay.
But the day that Kennedy was shot, I was sitting in Spanish class across from the fellow that I would marry in 2 years. And we got the announcement, and I looked over at him, and he looked at me, and we were just, appalled and devastated. Walked out of the classroom and bumped into my best friend since we were 4 years old together, and she was sobbing. And that's what I remember of the day Kennedy died. And the reason why that made such an impression was she was the granddaughter of the protege of Reverend William Criswell in Dallas at the First Baptist Church. So the connections beginning at that moment throughout my life were that kind of synchronicity, something that Hank and I shared, that he just felt that his entire life, every time he would turn around, he was encountering an incident, a situation, a person that somehow was reinforcing the assassination, the history of the assassination. And my father was the Grandmaster Mason of our small local lodge, and so he would have been in that milieu of the Freemasons, so that always kind of niggled me. My sister dated actually lived with John Connolly's brother for a number of years in San Antonio. Then I find myself working for the travel agency that handled the, petroleum and engineers and geologists. Then I find myself working for Neiman Marcus Travel and playing host to the Grolier Club, whose membership included John McCloy. So there were just road signs all along the way. And go ahead.
And when you say you worked for Hunt, we're talking about the Hunt oil billionaires, not the E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate.
Correct.
Right.
Hunt and his family. His daughter had, around the time, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the silver debacle in the late 70s.
That's right.
The Hunt brothers, right, Nelson and Herbert, had attempted to control the silver market on a global scale, and they got caught. And they got nailed, and they, were indicted. They were, their taxes, everything was investigated. Well, they had a lovely sister named Carolyn, and Carolyn, I believe, was advised that she needed to put her money in something that was legitimate on its face, that was not controversial, and her inheritance needed to be protected. And so she founded a company called Rosewood Development, and they launched the hotel company called Rosewood Hotels. It's still in business. The Chinese bought it for $100 million, I think, about 7 years ago, and they signed the papers here in Santa Fe at a hotel I used to work at. So, and we ran into her grandson who was signing the papers to sell this company we had worked for and helped build. Literally, we helped establish Rosewood Hotels on the international market, and we ran into the grandson at the dog park with our wolfhound, and I think they had a little muffy puppy, and we just introduced ourselves. He said he was Carolyn's grandson, and sure enough, that day they were signing the papers for Rosewood to sell to China. Anyway, so Carolyn had launched this company. I went to work for it as their sales manager and evolved up to the West Coast sales director for Rosewood at the Bel Air Hotel. So another fly on the wall, watching that kind of, just having that insight of what goes on in that environment, and that hotels are, they're a very safe place to meet and function. Oh, my first client at the mansion on Turtle Creek was the Brown Brothers Harriman Company. So, again, it was just as if, the story was being written and I happened to walk into it,
Gotcha. Now, we're here today to talk about Coup in Dallas, the decisive investigation to who killed JFK by H.P. Albarelli. Who was H.P. Albarelli?
H.P. Albarelli, where do you start? Not to overstate him, but he was just a unique, one in a billion human being, in my opinion, and I'll probably start weeping. His loss was so unexpected that, it was alarming. His background, I only know what I read in the papers, other than, him quietly, sharing certain attitudes, impressions, opinions, but he was just a dogged investigator with intuition that just, it was a radar. I'll share a vignette. We were watching the news of Jesse Smollett.
Yeah.
Do you remember that story?
Oh, yeah. And
it was the night that the news broke, and he turned and said, didn't happen that way. And I said, what do you mean? Because I was just enthralled and just sucked into the story and how outrageous, et cetera. He said, didn't happen, I promise you. So lo and behold, he was right. So I just learned that night that his intuition guided him. And I think that was his strongest suit. And he dug into areas, as you know from reading A Terrible Mistake, dug into areas no one would go. And he uncovered information that other investigators, documentary, and like Errol Morris, they just wouldn't touch some of the areas that he uncovered. And I think that was very frustrating for him. I think he's really proud of that investigation. And from there, he was, just pulled into the Kennedy work. And, for him, it just made sense. And in fact, one of the district attorneys that worked with him on that case said, one day Hank said something about JFK, and the guy laughed and said, I've been waiting for the Kennedy assassination to surface in this investigation. And he was serious. He was serious. They knew that they were onto something. So as for him, his own personal life, I know very, very little. He had a beautiful family, adored his grandsons. He befriended a lot of the people that he interviewed and investigated, including June Cobb. She became a good friend of his. She was his grandson's godmother. So, he just had a knack of building trust. He became friends with the Lafitte family, at least two members, and they trusted him. They trusted he would, keep his agreement, and I've done everything I can to make sure that we do, to the extent that I can sleep with myself. But I do think that now that he's gone, it's time to kind of break through that, not the agreement, but break through the confidentiality to the extent that I won't be sued. But I think the public needs to know this story.
Gotcha. And what we're talking about is the 1963 date book maintained by Pierre Lafitte. Who was Pierre Lafitte?
Pierre Lafitte was an enigma inside a riddle. He was born in, this is the official story. He was born in New Orleans to a woman who was one of the most well-known madams of a brothel, a very successful businesswoman. And her success got her run out of town. I think she knew too many people, too much information, too many skeletons, and they literally ran her out of town, purportedly. And she ended up in Marseille. Pierre was, I think, probably 2 or 3 when they left New Orleans. And then she abandoned him on the streets, and he raised himself with the wolves in Marseille, learned to be a chef, living there, and then just got in with the Corsicans, the drug crowds. His history goes back to the 20s and 30s. He then came back to the States. I mean, the trajectory of him going back and forth is very blurred. We don't have any solid timeline, but he was in the U.S. in about 1946 because he was working for a woman who would become his wife within about the year. Her husband and she owned a restaurant, the Top Hat, I think it was, in Manhattan, and Pierre was the maitre d'. And the husband ended up dead on a New York street, hit by a bus or a car, and Pierre married Renee within the year. And so he was kind of recruited by George Hunter White of the the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was a master imitator. He could disguise himself to even his best friends. There's a story that was James Angleton, who he met through George Hunter White, was dining one night, and they'd become friends, drinking buddies. And Pierre was the waiter in the restaurant, and he fooled Angleton. Angleton never knew it was him. So he was a master of disguise. He was a chameleon. He spoke several languages, and his primary thing was conning people. He was an art thief. He was a drug runner. He didn't fancy killing people, though. He didn't like blood. He didn't like guns, etc., which is sort of a conundrum because he was active in the death of Olson. But I think it was, maybe in his own mind, we consider it's probably benign. Pushing someone out of the window is not like slitting their throat. So throughout that period in the Cold War, that's what he was doing, was working for several agencies, including informing for Hoover. He informed on some of the mob. He testified in a huge drug trial in Chicago in the 50s. I don't know how he survived all this, other than he probably knew so much that people weren't certain that he wasn't keeping records, which in fact he was. And so they didn't know how to get to those records, maybe, so that was his protection. And a lot of people have speculated that the date book itself was for his protection. We can't work that out, because if it was, why didn't someone know about it? Why didn't the family store it safely? But instead, they kept it as a memento. And Hank just knocked on the door, met Pierre's wife, and literally they started talking, and she showed him Pierre's information and his material as if it was just keepsakes, not as if it was her protection. She didn't seem afraid that someone was going to steal it or bang her over the head for it. It was that, she just considered it valuable for history and because she loved her husband.
A couple of quick questions. Was there any suspicions that the death of the husband of the restaurant owner was a murder?
Well, of course, you push someone out a window.
Right, I don't know. You push them out a window, you push them in front of a bus. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and the other thing is how did H.P. Albarelli, how did he become aware of this date book to know to go knock on that door?
Well, can I just read a quick snippet in his own words?
Sure.
Okay. Before I completed my book on Frank Olson's murder, I had the opportunity to meet the one person who was quite close to Lafitte, his wife. I had been informed by a highly respected journalist for the New York Times, John Crudson, that Lafitte had been living in a small town in New England for at least 12 years. By chance, I had relatives in a nearby town. I mean, by chance, can you believe? This fellow was his nominal uncle, the family uncle, named Roger Hill, and Roger Hill had been the ambassador to Mexico years earlier. Hill had died, but his family still lived nearby where Lafitte was living, so he turned to them for help in locating Lafitte. As it turned out, he was living openly with his wife. Understandably, I traveled as quickly as possible to the place where they resided, which was quite easy because I was still living in Vermont, where I'd gone to write the Olson book. Of course, I shared the location and address with the district attorney's office in Manhattan, but ventured there on my own. I was too late to find Pierre. He had passed away before my arrival. But as I said, I had the opportunity to meet his wife, Renee. Our meeting was a cautious one, but I felt that by being honest about my interests and objectives, an initial bond of friendship was formed. That bond grew steadily stronger through the time when Renee located to Miami, Florida area, and as far as I know, nobody from the Manhattan DA's office ever made the same trip I did. What is important here is that I eventually gained conditional access to several of Lafitte's date books and a precious handful of his letters. I would guess that you can imagine my surprise when I was able to make out Lee Harvey Oswald's name in the 1963 date book. Over a short period, I found other names connected to Oswald, some identified only by initials O, OS, JA, and T. To make a long and convoluted story short, I was able to study Lafitte's 1963 date book, and as expected, although for entirely different reasons from my initial expectations, it was remarkable for its contents. Perhaps remarkable is not a strong enough word.
Now, sorry, I had moved the microwave. But now, you were telling me that there's some controversy over the authenticity of this date book. Well, what do you make of that?
Frustration.
Yeah.
I wear three hats in this project. One is the primary, and that's co-authoring with Hank and knowing him personally, being able to attest to his integrity. The other hat is the rational, objective, non-emotional, purely, objective person that says, I understand because I, too, have questioned other authors and their claims to have come across the most sensational evidence ever found, et cetera. So I'm sympathetic to that, and I understand it. And then the third hat is the frustration that the community, regardless of authenticity of this date book, will not discuss the information in the date book. They won't even consider and weigh, well, if it's not a hoax, is it important? Or if it's a hoax, let's find those aspects, those entries that obviously are a hoax. And people won't even, within the community, won't even venture to that. They just want the date book to go away, basically.
So then what is in the date book? What is the significance of this date book?
Well, it's a day-to-day spontaneous record of what's going on in Lafitte's world. There are notes in it that, say things like, L.O. is an idiot, but will be used anyway, and the L.O. is Oswald. So he's just making a remark to himself that someone has said, look, the guy is, dumb as a box of rocks. Maybe not, but he's just saying, we have to use him. He's going to be the perfect patsy. There are things like Otto says, come to Madrid. And we know that Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando that Hitler called his favorite commando, was in Madrid at the time. We know that Otto is in the date book and other entries that indicate that he is actually the strategist for the plot in Dallas. There are references to James Angleton, who says it's a go. He had assigned the project Lancelot Project, and he said Lancelot go. JJA says things like high-level gathering in D.C. The next day he says, Oswald in place. So we just see things in the date book that no one could have known in 63 unless they were directly involved. Now, the argument can be made that someone like a Lafitte in 73, 83, 93 picked up a blank instrument, a date book, which I'd like to get into in just a second, the actual instrument, the physical date book, and read enough books that they could go in and jot these notes down. But Dick Russell, who analyzed the date book partial for Hank and for a documentary company, wrote about a 3-page analysis and said there are entries in there that, it is my opinion, were not known until at least 1974, if later, but the ink and pen match the 60s. So how could someone, unless they collected ink and pen, have fabricated a date book, say starting in 70 or 80, without a great deal of effort? And why would they do that and then sit on it and wait for Albarelli to knock on the door in 2000 or 1998?
Well, then just to play devil's advocate here, because I worked in an office where the guy was a documents examiner, and this question came up: can you date a signature? Can you date a handwritten document? And one way to do that is, was it a fountain pen? Which wasn't, or was it a ballpoint pen, which only came about, I guess, in early 72, maybe 1970, ballpoint pens, right? I think they needed them for the astronauts, right? so they could write upside down, ballpoint pens. Right. But the thing is, you could have gotten a fountain pen and used it, you could buy a fountain pen today and write with it and say, oh yeah, this came before ballpoint pens, Is that how it was, the date was authenticated?
Well, the month, 2 months, no. In December of 2018, 6 months before Hank died,
right.
A documentary company from Australia had contacted him in the middle of 2018 and said, "This is a fascinating story." Picked you up on online and reading about it, and the guy was an amateur historian himself, so they flew over, met with Hank. He sat with them with not the date book. He didn't have the physical instrument, but they agreed, signed a contract that a documentary on Coup in Dallas would be very effective and profitable for them. So by 2018, he had convinced Renee's family to let him have access to the date book, took it to, or was in London, went to the authentication firm who actually does work for MI6, and they filmed Hank for about 8 hours with the date book. The handwriting expert was there. The ink analyst was there, who happens to be Ukraine-born, one of the most renowned. I won't give his name, but people can Google. Anyway, so he walked away having taken all of the samples of what you're describing, like of the ballpoint. There are pencils. There are sharper pencils than others in the date book, etc. And he told Hank verbally. Now, Hank was not paying for this authentication. The documentary company. Hank said, "I can't be involved in it. I'm benign. I'm the messenger." So the documentary company had hired the analysis and was paying for it a significant sum. And so the ink guy said verbally, "I have no problem with any of this other than there are a few samples that aren't in my database," which was one of the most sophisticated at the time. He had started his in the 60s, and he said, "But if whoever is writing this in this date book is traveling widely, like around the globe," which we know Pierre was, "then I wouldn't have all of the accessible instruments he could have picked up. He could have been in a hotel, he could have been at somebody else's office or whatever and picked up a pen that I might not have, say in Tunisia or Morocco or Luxembourg or whatever." So he was satisfied. But because his report was paid for by the documentary company, we can't access it because they had a non-disclosure agreement signed. The handwriting analyst, after about 6 hours, turned to Hank and said, now this is what Hank told me, said, if these comparative handwriting samples that you're handing me, because there were individual sheets, Hank had a postcard from Lafite, he had a note and he had some ledger sheets. So he said, if those are the same author as the date book, I will accept that they're all Pierre Lafite. But I can't write a report until I get extensive samples. So if you know this area, Ed, then you know that most authenticators want at least 100 handwritten samples. We had, I think, about 7. So we go back. Hank dies. I'm left with the date book, and so I flew out to Phoenix, hired another examiner, local, and he had the same issue. He said, I can write you a report, but it's going to be undefined, incomplete, because I don't have enough handwriting samples. And he said, you won't find anyone that's going to put anyone credible that's going to put their name on a report of authentication until you land more examples of Pierre's handwriting. So that's where we stand. There are legal issues. The Lafitte family is not interested in pursuing this at all. And Hank's estate are, I think still grieving, and they still probably have files that they haven't gone through. So we are attempting to land those samples this year.
Okay, so without getting any more into the bog of examples.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Coup in Dallas, the decisive investigation into who killed JFK by H.P. Albarelli. Now, so then what is Pierre Lafitte's theory, or not theory, what is his information, his firsthand knowledge of the assassination? How does he say it laid out?
Well, Alan Kent, who co-authored the book with us, he's not a copyright. He wrote essays and he had done research for Hank. So,
right.
His name is on the title page. He had. Tell me your question again.
Pierre Lafitte. If we're going to assume that the documents are correct, what is his theory? How does he say the assassination happened?
Alan coined the phrase project manager, and that set well with both Hank and myself. That's how we view him, that he was the boots on the ground in New Orleans, living in New Orleans, back and forth to Dallas because he knew the city. They traveled there a lot. And so he was the person that was the liaison between James Angleton, Bill Harvey, Otto Scorzini, and then the shooters themselves. So his notes in that date book reflect those responsibilities he had. Like they sent Oswald to Mexico City. We don't know precisely why, but we know he was there. Lafitte was in contact with Jack Crichton. He met Crichton in Dallas, and your listeners may not know the name, but he was running for governor at the time in Texas. And he is dominant in the investigation and has been for decades. A lot of people have questioned his involvement, possibly. So that was what Pierre was making notes of. But he also noted the names of shooters. And that is the breakthrough, I believe, that we don't have to just say, I wonder who it was or could it have been. And as people have joked, now there are 36 shooters because we have so many over the years. So many people have claimed to have been involved. But I trust that Lafitte is writing about what he knows and that we have the names of the shooters. And
who does Lafitte name as the shooters?
I'll start at the top with Jean-René Suetre.
The Corsicans. So he's the one that names the Corsicans. He thinks these are Corsicans, Spanish shooters.
Correct. Right, and La Cagoule, the important factor of Coup in Dallas is Hank starts with the end of the war, World War II, and carries it through the Cold War because you can see the through line. La Cagoule were these violent, radical, very traditional Roman Catholics who, hated communism to the extent that they would kill, and they were mercenary and they were for hire. And Jean-René Suetre had been a captain in the OAS, the French OAS, during the War for Independence in Algeria. So he was well trained and knew Otto Scorzini, knew Lafitte. They were all trusted, and that's the other part about the shooters is they were all had deep, deep connections to the people that hired them for a decade. Willoughby's guy, Jack Cannon, is another listed in the date book. A fellow named Charles Askins, who was a sharpshooter, border patrol guy in Texas. 3 people probably on Suetre's team were Gerard Litt, Jean-Paul René Filio, and his wife/girlfriend, Alice Lamy. They all show up in Dallas. And we believe that Robert Emmett Johnson, who's a known sniper, who was working in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, he shows up. And only in the last year, it's so sad because Hank did not recognize what 2 entries in the date book were leading to, we believe, Roscoe White. And if anybody knows that story, it's very controversial. There's a new book coming out this month about Roscoe White by his son and Gary Shaw and Brian Edwards, two very reputable investigators. And I believe that is going to help kind of turn the QE2 around because that story has been belittled far too long and needs to be revived. And we think that Lafitte was aware that Roscoe White was involved in dealing.
Now, did the Lafitte, the date book, did this need to be translated from one language to another?
No. There are a couple of French phrases, but only 2 or 3.
Gotcha. Now, these the shooters you've named here, have their names ever come up by other researchers or investigators in the past?
The man who knew too much, Dick Russell, was the first to identify Jack Cannon as having been in charge of the Z organization during the Korean War for General Charles Willoughby. So when he saw Cannon in the date book, I think, now Dick does not put his name on the date book. He doesn't standby authentication, nothing. He just says, how would anyone know about Cannon? Because I only published about him in 93. And let me think, Swetra is very controversial. There have been books written to debunk the fact that he was the French guy who was expelled from Dallas on the 22nd, picked up by the INS. I have reason to believe that those people who don't want Swetra to be in Dallas are responsible for, sowing the seed that he wasn't. And I think that because of Lafitte, we have evidence that he was. And so that's my next project, is to expose those people who covered up Swetra's role.
Does the Lafitte have a location of where the shooters were?
No, but we're getting close, because I told Hank when I met him, I said, I think the case can be solved soup to nuts. People say, oh, no, you'll never figure that out. And there are researchers out there who stay below the radar, who can understand ballistics and preference of weapon and style of shooting. So I think we're going to be able to piece together something that would be a convincing hypothesis. We probably would not win a court case, but I believe that we have got a solid hypothesis in play. I think the new Rob Reiner, Soledad O'Brien are venturing into that area in their podcast, Who Killed JFK, and I believe they're going to name 4 shooters. I'm dying to hear who they name, and because I know Dick Russell has been involved in that project, so we know Swetra, because Dick also named Swetra, and I believe that Dick will influence their decision to name Swetra and Cannon. So the wild cards are who are the other 2, and we'll just see if they coincide with what Lafitte had.
Now, what about some of the other well-known names that surround this whole mishmash, this whole wild conspiracy? And no one could make this up, man. There are these characters involved in all this. Have any of them prior to this mentioned Mr. Lafitte?
No, and that's no. George Hunter White. Now, he's sort of, again, a wild card in the investigation, because he seems to be only have been just this crazy, mad, scientist wannabe with Sidney Gottlieb in the MK Ultra programs and that kind of thing. And his papers reflected Lafitte, reflected their friendship. But for some reason, people who write about George Hunter White, including, I think, Tom O'Neill that wrote Chaos about the Mansons, they would read through that, and I just think that because they didn't, Jeff Morley had seen the Hunter White papers, and I think because Lafitte was an unknown name, they may have brushed past it, but because Hank had been investigating the Olson murder only, he knew the significance of the name. He could pick up the trail and see, and then Crudson, this John Crudson, the investigator, he had identified Lafitte in 1977 as being involved with Gottlieb and George Hunter White, and no one picked up on it. And I think that's the other thing, and I just, candidly think that there is some professional jealousy that, Hank, just he followed his nose. He was a good investigator, and he just picked up the lead and ran with it. And I think others, brushed over it. I think John Crudson even said it's one story that he regrets the most that he didn't follow through.
Well, there certainly is a lot of professional jealousy in this crowd. It's some of the most amazing I've ever seen.
Yes.
This is
It's a small pond.
Yeah, it's a tough group. It's a tough crowd. Now, but Pierre Lafitte, what would qualify him to be the project manager on such a big operation? Did he have any kind of intelligence training or military sniper type training, any kind of counterintelligence, any kind of paramilitary training?
We don't see a lot of we don't see evidence of that. There are clues and breadcrumbs, but I go back to him raising himself with the wolves. I think he just had, again, an instinct for survival, and he wanted to make money. He loved his family, wanted to provide for them. They didn't live ostentatious. But as far as training, I think Hunter White would have been the one that took him under his wing. But prior to that, there are testimonies from the family that Lafitte served in the Charlemagne unit at the end of the war. Now, what his training was he a sniper? I don't think so. There's no indication that he pursued a career in assassinating people himself. And the training that he got, I think, was, hands-on, on the ground, in real time.
Now, what about criminal record? What was his criminal record like?
An arm long.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, just give us a brief idea. What was this crime?
Well, there were two major cases. One was a fellow named Ralph Loomis, who was a diamond dealer, African diamonds and exotic flowers. And Lafitte conned him out of, I think, about $500,000. I don't know how it worked, but he did. He just got involved with him in a business deal, and Loomis filed charges. Loomis died before he could testify in court. So Lafitte was let off the hook.
That's always a lucky answer. It's a lucky break there.
I'm anxious to know if Loomis was pushed out of a car.
I was going to say, yeah. Did he fall from a window as well?
The preferred mode of assassination. The other one was I think he stole art from a cathedral in a small town in Kentucky. I mean, he just did these wild, crazy capers. Right. He was involved with a French intelligence officer, head of the French at the time intelligence, and they robbed the wife of what's the guy in India? What's it called?
All right. Okay. Not Mahatma Gandhi?
No. The head of the Sikhs in India.
Oh, I have no idea.
Aga Khan. Khan.
Now, was this an armed robbery or again a finesse?
Yes, armed robbery. I think it was in broad daylight. Her jewelry. They ran her off the road and took her jewelry from her.
Okay. Now, what about any crimes of documents, forgery, document preparation, of filling out the applications fraud?
Yes, I believe that there was bond fraud.
Okay.
There's a fellow in Canada who has volunteered. He's got the skills to do it, to see if we can track down any of the affidavits maybe that Lafitte might have signed or written out, handwritten. Because if he was testifying, chances are they made him sign things, et cetera. So I don't know if those documents would still be around. We have his real estate transactions. He was a legitimate citizen of New Orleans, and he, signed a lease for a house and that kind of thing. So we have some of that. But in terms of was he skilled at forging a date book?
Yeah.
I think that's where you're going. He could have been, but we go back to that same question. Why would his wife sit on it and wait for a reporter to knock on the door?
Any reports from family or friends that he came into some large compensation around the time of the JFK assassination? No,
there's no evidence of that at all. He went to ground. We think he left the country.
Oh, really?
He was in Kentucky he got arrested. He came back to the U.S. in 1967 and went to work as chef of the Plimsoll Club. That's Clay Shaw's international trademark restaurant. Shaw had just retired, but Lafitte was hired, so we have every reason to think that Clay Shaw knew Pierre Lafitte. And so he came back. Then the Loomis case reared its head again, and the Boston feds came to New Orleans, arrested Pierre, took him back to Boston. Loomis was dead, and so then Pierre went to ground. We think probably they ended up maybe in Martinique, maybe someplace in Europe, and then came back to the U.S. and settled in New England, where he lived out his life peacefully, raised a family, grandchildren, great-grandkids now, a salt-of-the-earth apple pie family. And I think that's why, I'm cautious, and I know that's Hank's commitment was, I won't expose the family. They do not inherit the sins of the father or grandfather, and they need to live out their lives, fulfilling their own dreams and shouldn't be saddled. I think we argue that for most families that are, that their ancestors have been involved in these kinds of murders and assassinations, but those people are on payroll, government payroll. This family is not. They did not sign on. They didn't benefit. So that's why I'm very protective of the identities of Hank's sources.
Anyone in the family report to you that he had talked about this kind of thing?
Meaning who, Hank?
No, Pierre Lafitte, that he had spoken about. Hey, JFK, I was there.
Yes. The
Okay.
wife and another party in the family were totally privy. Renee was in Dallas.
And
she has since passed on.
Now, did H.P. Albarelli, did he get a chance to interview the wife and the family and record their interviews?
Well, as I read in his introduction, he met the wife the day that he knocked on the door,
right.
And that was during the Olson investigation as it was wrapping up, and as he was wrapping up a terrible mistake. And then he knew her until her death in 2000. Then he befriended someone else in the family and knew her for the next 10, 15 years. No, there are no tape recordings of interviews. The woman kept her identity extremely close. And so he probably has handwritten notes in his own archives, Hank does, or HP does.
Right.
But as far as anything that would be tangible, like confessions or third-hand corroboration, I suspect that Hank was very careful about maintaining that kind of a record.
Does anybody have access to these notes?
The estate owns the archive. We are I'm in the process of making certain that no one has access to that Lafitte material without my being involved, because we had planned a sequel in emails with Hank and I, and Alan is privy to this, that we were going to, write the rest of the story. So that material belongs to Coup in Dallas. So if I have to, I will, have to ask for an injunction to make sure that the archives are protected until we can finalize the sequel.
Gotcha. And the family of Lafitte, they're not talking to anybody now?
No one. One family member said, respectfully, never contact me again.
Gotcha. Now
so
we only
really just want it to go away.
We've been talking to Lesley Sharp. You can find her on the Education Forum. She posts there quite a bit. You can also find her on Facebook, Lesley Sharp with no E at the end, SHARP. The book we're talking about is Coup in Dallas, The Decisive Investigation of Who Killed JFK, written by H.P. Albarelli Jr. And like I said, you can look that up on the archives and find a previous interview I did with Mr. Albarelli. Might say Hank on that title. Now, are there any questions I haven't asked you that you'd like to cover in the next 4 minutes?
I would like to go back to a central character that is airbrushed from this investigation. And Mae Brussel first exposed Otto Skorzeny. She didn't know about Otto's wife, Ilse, and they are dominant throughout 1963 in Lafitte's world. Madrid, we believe, was the base from which the actual strategy was concocted, back and forth from Madrid to Ireland, where they had purchased a home. So that aspect and the international component, the North African, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, that aspect has been buried. And we are intent on pursuing the leads to Otto and Ilse, and where that leads is a greater concern because it stems from America First, World War II, all the way through line to our current crisis of possible fascism taking over the country.
Gotcha. And for the audience probably knows, but we do play the May Brussels archives on Sundays. I'm doing them Saturday mornings too. Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings we play the old May Brussels shows. Yeah, in conjunction with the May Brussels Project. They're trying to raise funds for a May Brussels library. So check that out too and support that if you can. I interviewed both of her daughters too about the history of May Brussels. Oh boy, this is incredible stuff.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, right.
I wasn't aware of that. That's fantastic, Ed. Wonderful.
H.P. Albarelli Jr. is the author of this book. The book's about 3 inches thick. You can, if someone breaks into your house, you can hit them with this book. Right? And you'd make out all right. You'd be okay. And our guest once again is Lesley Sharp, delightful woman. Thank you so much, Lesley. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate your time too.
You can find her on Facebook. And also, too, on the Education Forum, which is mostly people love to debate the JFK topic on the Education Forum. The book is Coup in Dallas, The Decisive Investigation into Who Killed JFK by H.P. Albarelli Jr. Lesley, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Good night.